some of you know John, but you'll have to put up with me saying a few things. I don't like to make long introductions because then people are getting nervous. They want me to go away. But I don't know if you still are, but you recently have been a core faculty member of Pacific University in the MFA program, right?
I'm not anymore. I'm retired and writing.
Retired. Are you still writer at large at
No,
the,
no,
no, not even writer at large, but you are a writer at large.
I am at large.
But he was writer at large at College of Idaho, right? And there are other things too, but those are the two most recent jobs, unless you're doing something else in your retirement.
I'm really trying to retire, but
I have never succeeded.
it's hard.
Mm-hmm. Well, then you can write more. And the first book you put out was Coyote, right?
In the mountains.
Coyote in the Mountains, book of short stories. And then there was second, I believe, is Cheerleaders from Gomorrah. And that was short stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then came MFA in a Box. I was so delighted when I saw all these books because I've enjoyed your book so much, your latest book, that I'm ordering them all. Sudden Death Over Time, which was also short stories. And then that memoir that is Trampoline Coming Home to Sawtooth Valley.
Trap lines.
Trap lines. Oh, what did I write down? I wrote that down. My mind was trampolining.
I kind of like the idea of trampoline.
Yeah, you bounced right back to Idaho.
Talk about a life trajectory.
And then 100 Little Pieces on the End of the World, which is wonderful and lovely, and what you're going to be talking about tonight. And I won't say more about your background. I mean, it says on our publicity you grew up in Sun Valley, in Idaho, right close to the Sawtooth Valley. But you're going to tell us some more about that too. So John, you can take it away and we'll all kind of mute and get out of here.
Well, thank you, Susan. And if this starting routine was designed to put the writer at ease, it worked.
Well, good. You could see how we're trying to work the technology, so that it takes away from it.
It
All right, let's all
much
mute.
better about my own technology. What I'm going to do tonight is, well, I guess it's just this afternoon, but I'm looking at about a 20-minute reading, and followed by as many questions or as long a questions as you want. I'll be here. I'm reading from the first chapter, and I took excerpts from the first chapter, and it's called The Way We Live Now. It should give us enough to talk about. There's a lot of dismaying and controversial, and I hope wonderful material in it. So I'll get on that right now, and we'll see where it leads the discussion. I know how to harness a horse to a plow. I know how to do basic blacksmithing and welding, pack a horse, shoe the same horse, and use a crosscut saw on a broadaxe. I can fell a big tree in a desired direction when permitting. I know how to trap beaver, coyote, and muskrat and build a tight log cabin with hand tools and indigenous materials. I can kill and skin and cut up elk and deer, trim and adjust kerosene lanterns, irrigate, milk a cow, and take care of chickens. I can stay safe and warm while camping in below zero temperature and start fires in wet weather. I know basic wilderness medicine and can treat burns, open wounds, and broken legs. Except for tree felling every firewood season with a gas-powered chainsaw, I haven't used these skills in 40 years. I don't miss using them. I don't ever want to use them again. Most of them were obsolete when I was born, and I would never have learned them, except that when I was 3, my father quit his life as a hard rock miner and moved to a small homestead in Sawtooth Valley. He became a fishing and hunting guide and a trapper. Our household economy was mostly pre-industrial. We kept chickens and pack horses and ate wild game and wild salmon. We heated with firewood, and until the electrical grid reached us a few years later, we used oil lamps for light. By the standards of our neighbors and my grade school classmates, we were poor. My parents had mortgaged our family's future to buy our 40 acres. I can remember nights when my parents stayed up late with their ledger trying to figure out how they could make another $75 monthly payment when the clients were few and the expenses many. A decade after we had moved to the valley, when the guiding business faltered because of dam-caused destruction of Idaho's salmon runs, my father contracted to build trails in the Sawtooth primitive area where equipment with wheels wasn't allowed. We had to use pack horses and hand tools and child labor. Child labor was me. I spent several adolescent summers staring at the back end of a harnessed horse, guiding a one-sided plow, peeling the hillside rocks out and down to make new trail. We were 18 miles from a road. Our stove was a campfire. Our shower was a 5-gallon fire-blackened steel bucket with a shower head welded to its bottom. We ate fish and canned ham, and after the fresh greens ran out, canned peas, canned beans, and potatoes, lots of potatoes. All through those summers, sun-glittering B-52s flew 30,000 feet above our heads, scattering aluminum chaff that decorated the alpine firs like tinsel. They reminded us that in a day or less, our tents and kitchen and sleeping cots, our shower bucket and creekside food cache, and even our unfinished trail, these could lose all meaning. The high valley we camped in, full of lakes, waterfalls, mossy meadows, and house-size blocks of granite, would no longer be home to horse or human. Neither would any place else. When I turned 18, old enough to work for the federal government, I became a U.S. Forest Service wilderness ranger and refined my horse packing and hand tool skills. I got an EMT certificate. I ski patrolled at the Sun Valley Ski Resort during college vacations. My seasonal jobs paid my tuition, which illustrates how long ago I attended college. After graduation, I quit the Forest Service and the ski patrol and began teaching English in a small private school in Sun Valley. I left teaching to write a cardiology for layman book. After that, I went back to school for a graduate degree that allowed me to teach English Lit and magazine journalism at the College of Idaho, a small liberal arts college 40 miles west of Boise. During my first few years of teaching college, I published personal essays in a local arts weekly, one of them about being 16 and stuck out in the wilderness where my closest friends were my horse and my Pulaski. I confessed what I really wanted was to be a lifeguard at the Sun Valley Lodge pool. It didn't really matter that I couldn't swim. It didn't matter what I really wanted either. I wasn't lifeguarding. I was working long summer days in dust and heat and mosquitoes. For recreation, I took to naming minor sawtooth peaks and trees and waterfalls after my previous school year's crushes. I hadn't yet realized that starting a first day of school conversation with "I named a tree after you" didn't qualify as a social skill. It was a bittersweet essay, and after it was published, I received a bittersweet letter from a young woman who described growing up lonely on a cattle ranch in Eastern Oregon, 50 miles from any highway. She described high school summers of yearning to sit by a municipal pool, talking and laughing with friends and getting a tan. Instead, she spent her school vacations moving cattle on a skittish horse, fighting gnats and horseflies and sunburn, surrounded on all sides by a sagebrush-fringed horizon. It was a letter that changed my life. In subsequent conversations, its author and I discovered that neither of us would get on a horse again if we could help it, and that neither of us saw value in rejecting the comforts of technology. Both of us preferred contemporary industrial civilization to its alternative, however romantic that alternative might appear. Both of us felt in retrospect that our alienated adolescences had given us essential adult strengths, but we were certain there were easier ways to get them. We discovered other things in common, such as a weakness for lounging around the pools of hot springs resorts, as long as they didn't make you ride their horses. But it was our differences that caused us to marry each other a few years later. Julie's still a sweet young thing, at least in my eyes, and I'm not. But between my caution and experience and her energy and enthusiasm, we've made it 27 good years together. We love each other without reservation, is one way of putting it. We laugh a lot, is another. For many of those years, we earned 2 salaries, no kids. We paid off our house and cars and put one of the salaries into savings. We still might be in those jobs, saving and slaving away, except for the 2000 presidential election, which brought George Bush and Dick Cheney to power. That election caused us to look critically at our careers, at the institutions we worked for, at the people whose judgment we trusted, and where the next few decades might find us. The country itself began to resemble a decaying stage set. Some of my students were going deep into debt to pay for their college degrees, and I knew that without luck and sacrifice and more luck, that debt was going to stay with them for life. Older faculty colleagues began showing the stress of their jobs in their bodies and faces, and they began questioning how they had spent their lives. One of them at his retirement party turned to me and said, "If there's one thing I learned in 40 years of teaching, it's that institutions don't love you back." My parents, still on their place in Sawtooth Valley, were old enough to need help with their everyday life. Their age and frailty, when they had always seemed powerful, decisive, and independent, reminded us that our own independence was limited. We needed to spend it in ways that were full of meaning, or because meaning itself was starting to seem fragile, full of days fixing fences, or cutting firewood, shoveling snow, and cleaning irrigation ditches, replacing logs in the walls of old cabins, to honor the real in any way we could think of doing it. 15 years ago, not knowing how long the world would last, but thinking it wasn't going to last long, we left our careers, sold our house, bought annuities, and retreated to a cabin I had built on my parents' place. We turned our jobs into long-distance electronic endeavors, and the hit we took in income was less than what we saved in expenses. We still don't have a garden because it still frosts some summer nights. We can't watch broadcast TV, but we do have broadband and a Netflix subscription. We have an old pickup for firewood, an old SUV for winter roads, and a not so old car that gets decent gas mileage, an essential thing here in the valley where there's no public transportation and likely never will be. Except for a frantic 2.5-month tourist season every summer, we live more or less by ourselves. My parents, now gone for a decade, lived as long as they could in a place they loved, and they serve as our example. Isolation is the price we pay. Our community is geographically gated. In the dark days of winter, there are maybe 100 people in our surrounding 100 square miles. We don't go outside unless it's above 10 below. Some days we don't go outside at all because inside are good books and a warm fire and tea water boiling in the kettle atop the stove. Neither Julie nor I grew up middle class, but we backed into its lower childless reaches, just when the rest of America's middle class and its world started to unravel. Not long after we moved to Sawtooth Valley, I started writing a column for a paper in Ketchum, the small tourist town that fills the space between Sun Valley Resort and its ski mountain. Tourism is a delicate business, subject to economic or climate or pandemic catastrophes. And my column became a forum for apocalyptic musings. For some time, I'd been an après moi le deluge guy. Although for me, the deluge wasn't nuclear, biological, or chemical. I had simply observed that screens were replacing real life in the lives of my students. They were getting good, expensive educations, but I wasn't sure they would be able to connect them with anything of substance. That and the fact that in our corporate and government boardrooms, it more and more looked as if the folks who obeyed their basest impulses were running the country. The people who operated according to reason and careful observation didn't think they could run anything but their own lives, and sometimes not even those. I called my column Endnotes because I could Google end of days any day of the week and have my pick of 2 million or so separate dooms to write about. Jesus was riding in at the head of an angel SWAT team, or a 14-mile-long asteroid was about to crash into LA, or the star spawn of the dread Cthulhu was at last rising out of the Marianas Trench. These things were fun to write about and fun to make fun of, but after a year or so, the Doom of the Month Club turned mean. Lots of the doomsayers I was reading were not delusional ranters. They were sober social critics, economists, historians, and climate scientists. These experts became more and more compelling as time went on. Once we had moved to Sawtooth Valley, it became apparent how vulnerable Julie and I remained to the civilization from which we had physically removed ourselves. Our savings would become worthless. The electricity would go out. Gasoline and propane would disappear down an energy return on energy invested dry hole. We'd freeze to death, unshowered, in the dark. We'd succumb to heat stroke on a summer night when the wet bulb temperatures stayed above 37 degrees centigrade. Marauding hordes escaping wrecked cities on bicycles would shoot us as we fled out the door of our cabin, which they had set on fire to get at the canned goods in our crawl space. We would die before our time, in other words. So would a lot of other people. During my career as a professor, a colleague in the psychology department was married to a survivalist. She would lecture all day on the basal ganglia, the limbic system, and the amygdala, and then go home where her husband's reptile brain had caused him to bury a Quonset hut in the backyard and stock it with freeze-dried food, fuel, a chemical toilet, thousands of flashlight batteries, and tens of thousands of rounds of ammo. Faculty wits used to speculate that their sex life was better than their conversation. When I spoke with Julie about my concern that our savings might not outlast our lives, that we might need 10 years worth of freeze-dried food, that I was still thinking about purchasing a small arsenal for under the bed. Nothing special, you understand, just an M14, a samurai sword, and some mail order pathogens. She said, if civilization collapses, I don't want to live. Not in an overshot world in the midst of a die-off, even if we have a fully equipped bunker, even with solar power, even with a geothermal greenhouse, even with weapons that could depopulate half of Idaho. It's a shock when the person you love tells you they don't want to make it through the coming bottleneck. It means one solid choice is to become a victim of circumstance. But it also sparks a round of honest thinking. And out of that honest thinking comes the realization that in the long run, we're all victims of circumstance. All of us are hostage to a civilization that, judging from what it's doing to the place we live, doesn't love us back. A corollary, some of us will leave that unloving relationship. When when people say that a kill or be killed life won't be worth living, they've reached that conclusion after carefully examining the realities of collapse for their own lives and the lives of the people around them. That's where Julie and I find ourselves now, even with lives that have been happier and longer than expected. A happy old age is still possible for us, but if only if something that's demonstrably killing the planet. Industrial civilization with its global CO2 emissions, estrogen mimicking plastics, trash-filled oceans, earth sterilizing agribusinesses, deep ocean oil blowouts, ministries of tourism, and periodic nuclear accidents. That has to keep on keeping on. Business as usual might be good news when you're hoping to live 20th century lifespans in a 21st century environment, but it's bad news for people who love their grandchildren. They can only hope that their grandchildren will, when all is said and done, love them back. Back when I turned 62, I signed up for Social Security. It was a surprising and disturbing rite of passage, not easily diffused by humor. But I joked that it was as close as I would ever get to receiving a MacArthur grant. I joked I'd been hoping all my life to get money back from the government, which had never been a sure thing. I joked it was going to be all fun tickets and not all cat food, not with money still in the bank, not with the bank still standing, not with the dollar a recognized currency. These are not really jokes. I figured I'd sign up at age 62 rather than waiting for 66 because I wasn't sure if by the time I reached 66, the retirement age wouldn't be 70. And if I waited until then, you get the idea. I also worried I would outlast our government's willingness to put funds in my bank account every month. I worried I would outlast our government, come to think of it. So I got in while the getting in was still a thing. That was the good thing. That was the good news. The bad news was that old age, which for most of my life had been safely distant, had arrived on my doorstep. It wasn't carrying an AR-15, but it smiled an evil smile that suggested it was going to kill me anyway. Julie and I both have Alzheimer's in our families, and at least if civilization goes away, neither of us will end our days hallucinating the past in a nursing home. The saying goes that there are no pockets in the shroud, which is usually taken to mean you can't take your money with you. After taking care of a parent with Alzheimer's, I've realized there are also no pockets for what remains among the living. What you possess in the grave has to have preceded you there. It's a short imaginative journey from taking care of a parent with Alzheimer's to thinking that we live in a civilization with Alzheimer's, if the insistent cultural belief in a long disappeared world is any indication. I worry about dying before Julie, even if she is more capable and self-sufficient than most people. I keep offering to buy her a pink .38 revolver for her birthday, but she refuses to learn to use it. When we first got together, I joked about her throwing herself on my funeral pyre, which caused her to joke about running off with this strong young guy who had built the funeral pyre. But lately she's been saying, "It's been a good life with you. I don't want it to end. It's a beautiful world. I don't want it to end either. I love you both, and if I could make our adventure last and last, I would." Forever? Forever would get boring, but for a good long time. I think more about my death when she's talking like this than I do when she's talking about my death. I wish I had the courage to live each day like Julie does. She worries less than I do, and she knows that life is worth living until it isn't. Seeing the world through her courageous eyes, I've realized that there are other ways of living than brooding darkly on the second law of thermodynamics. She shows me that with enough courage, you can accept the persistence of entropy. You can understand that the person you love will do well for herself until she doesn't, and that our civilization did well for itself until it didn't. Not happy realizations, but necessary ones if we're going to turn honest faces to each new day as it arrives in the world. Well, I hope that's given us something to talk about, comment on, or ask questions about. I'm not afraid of questions I can't answer, but I will tell you I don't know if I don't know.
Yes, I know that you said you don't predict the future, but predicting the present is hard enough. That was great. People that you can unmute yourself if you have a question, because I have some, but I'd like to hear from you first.
I think we have a question from Beverly, if the hand means anything.
Beverly?
Well, Beverly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there you go.
We were just thanking you for your reading, and it just really hit home, us as a couple here, and just kind of brought us back to the moment here of gratitude for just sharing our lives here right now. So it was just it was a thank you for your words and your reading, John, and we really appreciate your time. And it's just, I was just sitting here thinking, it doesn't seem like you at all, John. What you're reading there. It seems more like my dad, but you look at my dad and you can tell that he catastrophizes and is pretty, not happy with where the world's going. So I think you're more like your wife than you know, honestly.
But that's not a bad thing.
I don't think it is either at all. So, and I did take note on there are no pockets in the shroud. I'm gonna look into that and send it to my dad because I'm trying to get him to spend his money. So
Try to get him to live in the present. It's not what we're used to.
yeah,
But it does take something like a future that's suddenly unpredictable to make us look around and say, well, what is certain in our lives? And here we are.
yeah. I guess what's certain is uncertainty, I guess. And all we have is the present. So yeah, it's been a pleasure, and we just appreciate that you guys had this and held this event. And we're gonna look a little more into you, John. You've got an awesome story.
Send your dad a copy of my book. That's what.
That's what the best I can do. All right, sounds good, John. Thank you very much. We'll stick around.
Lori, do you have some questions for John?
Yeah, I do have a question, John. I appreciated your reading, and I often have similar thoughts, and I find that it's hard to find people to talk about this kind of stuff with. I'm surprised you've got so many people on the screen. And I'm wondering if you have found the same, you have your wife, obviously you two are of like minds, but I'm a single person, and it requires, I think, an ability to see the world in a larger space and in a larger way. And that's not that common. So I'm wondering, do you have a cohort of people that you discuss this with, or mostly just your wife?
Well, I discuss it with Julie and Gary, who are also on the screen. But I up to the point when the pandemic interrupted all our lives, I was giving readings at the Ketchum Community Library, which has a nice lecture hall. And I was reading these chapters from time to time. And people kept coming back, although I had a tendency to kill questions that I would end the reading and everybody would just sort of go, oh, and sort of silently file out of the room.
Well, I think the material is dark.
It's very dark, and since the pandemic has begun, the context of the book has changed a lot. I have hopes that the book got better because of the change in context, and became sort of a manual for what sort of sensibility allows you to face a lot of the bad news we're facing and still greet each day with gladness. And what I've what I've sort of concluded is that I spent a lot of time in these chapters working with the microcosm, because the big picture doesn't look very good. The big picture is really scary, and there are a lot of people out there who are a lot more pessimistic than I am. One of the places that I started writing some of this material was as a guest writer on a website called Nature Bats Last. And Guy McPherson runs that website. And he's sort of famous as the doomiest of all doomsters, who believes that human extinction will happen in 4 or 5 or 6 years. I don't feel that. And I am grateful to Guy for letting me sort of take over his space from time to time, because eventually that formed the core of this book. But a lot of times I was writing, trying to figure out how, if you have a limited amount of time in this world, how are you going to spend it? And you start phrasing questions like that, and eventually you realize you've got a limited amount of time in this world. It's sort of one of the conditions of our lives. So the amount of time became less important than what I was discovering to do in any amount of time. And I really start looking at these small moments as the only moments we've got. So that's the gist of my conversation with a lot of people these days. Is how do you look at bad news? Sorry, someone was speaking. I interrupted.
That was Guy. How does you deal with in the book? How do you look at all the things that are happening and not be depressed? I know you spend some time on that. The book has a lot more in it, a lot more of the dark stuff, but I found it not depressing to read. I think it's the writing and the clarity of thought and the fact that you say it so well. But I have a question, unless someone else has one first, but I have a question about different places in the book you say different things. At one point you talk about, what a different world it would be if Jeremy Bentham discovered, instead of the greatest happiness for the greatest human beings is the greatest, but instead discovered that the greatest good was loving and taking care of this beautiful world and everything in it. Yet in another place you talk about what makes us human is being connected with other human beings. But it made me wonder, what about being connected to those beautiful things out in the world? If you deal with the microcosm, I was thinking about the writer that we had not very long ago, Tyson Yunkaporta from Australia, who sees every living thing as equal to human. So I thought I would like to see what your take on that kind of a thing involved in making us human as well.
John, can you rephrase Susan's question? Because I don't understand her question. And if you do, if you could rephrase it before you answer it, that would be super.
If he understands it.
That's a good point. You bring up the chapter, which is extremely problematic, because I talk about Jeremy Bentham, who said, the greatest good for the greatest number is the only measure of good. That's all we need to consider in ethical situations. I also bring up the problem of Jainism, which Peter Singer later in that chapter brings up, where he suggests that anything that wants to live should be allowed to live. And then I go into some problematic issues about shopping in the Costco meat department and buying expensive bottles of wine at the same time somebody like Peter Singer is saying, you buy that expensive bottle of wine and the $40 you spend could keep 3 or 4 African children alive for 2 or 3 months. And you can't just simply send $40 to Africa and then buy your wine, because then it's become an $80 bottle of wine, which could keep even more children alive. I think if I can rephrase Susan's question, it's how do you live in a world and make ethical decisions and not have the big picture simply overwhelm any possible decision you could make? And my answer to that is I don't know, except to you can't start thinking about the greatest number anymore. Humanity passed that somewhere around 3 billion at a point where the Green Revolution managed to propel us from 3 billion to 8 billion in our lifetimes. It kind of made Jeremy Bentham from a philosopher of happiness into a philosopher of destruction, and I'm at a loss to say what you do in the face of that. So I've turned to the microcosm and hope that each day I don't do anything overtly cruel. And you can spend a lot of time worrying about that too, because as Peter Singer delights in saying, you're going to do something cruel whether you want to or not, as long as you continue to live as a middle-class American, day to day to day. Look at that Costco card and realize that you're participating in a criminal act. I end that chapter by saying, well, Julie and I invite Peter Singer to dinner, and Jeremy Bentham's auto icon, which is his mummy that they still keep at University College in London in a glass case, we invite him too. And the 4 of us sit around a table and have a conversation, trying to find things we can agree on. And kindness is one of those things we can agree on, and doing the best we can under the circumstances is also. But there's huge differences between our basic outlook once you bring utilitarianism into it.
You want to have some more questions? Yes, go ahead.
John mentioned that we all have discussed his book before, and we had read earlier iterations of it, and I love the end result, and I appreciate John your speaking today. It's just really interesting to hear you not only read but also answer the questions. When we all discussed your book, there was no pandemic, and so it just seemed like your book was fairly dark, and the things you were predicting wouldn't or couldn't happen. But Then the pandemic arrived after your book was published, I think, or about the same time. And we watch what's happening around our country in particular, but around the world. But the rest of the world seems to handle it better than we've been handling it. And I wonder if your thoughts have changed much in terms of our future, 4 to 6 years or longer. And I'm kind of on Julie's side in that this is such a beautiful world, and we live in Haley, Idaho, so we wake up every morning and see these mountains and blue sky or snow on the trees, whatever, and I'm just thankful to be alive. So, but then I see the news, and it just, I think, oh my God, what's happening?
You're
Can you
cutting
comment
out.
on that?
You're cutting out. Could you repeat that last sentence?
I see the pandemic news and I think, oh my God, what is happening in this world? And I think you're closer to the truth than most of the rest of us are. But I wonder if you wanted to expand on that a little bit.
Okay. Well, one of the things I always sort of insisted on when I was conducting discussions of these chapters was that you can't predict the future. And I say that in my introduction. I do slip here and there and point the reader in the direction of maybe a conclusion that things might not be happening happily in 5 or 6 years for any of us. And I'll predict the future enough to say that we're going to remember 2019 as a different world as we go on into the future. Beyond that, I can't say. I can look at certain things that have happened this summer in the way that this country's dealt with the pandemic, and it seems like one horrible vulnerability of our country has been the fact that we are divided and seem to be dividing further into hostile communities. And so you can name half a dozen division points, and then since we're living in a tourist area that is getting hit with a whole lot of people who have bought RVs and motorhomes for the first time, and they all seem to be driving by our house 24 hours a day. There's a further division point of tourists and locals. And if I talk to some of my friends who live here in the valley in the winter, they're praying for January when everybody goes away and we can sort of reclaim our territory. You see the same thing happening in Rome and Venice. And now that the pandemic has emptied the streets, the locals are sort of creeping out of their cellars and looking around and seeing their cities for the first time in a long time. I think we have done a very bad job of dealing with the pandemic because we have always said in this frenzy of denial, it's going to happen to those other people. And, you know, you see it with young people saying, well, you know, it's just going to happen to the baby boomers and they need to get out of the way anyway. Or you see it early on when they found, when they started doing racial analyses, you know, that there were people going around saying it's not going to happen to our race. And you that's unimaginable brutality in their words. And they're spoken with sort of a self-righteous smugness And that's the kind of country we're living in right now. I'm not at all happy with the way ordinary Americans are saying, it's not going to happen to me, because obviously it is happening to a whole bunch of ordinary Americans. And so our capacity for denial is going to kill us if we keep at it. Susan?
Yeah, and something that you say in there about Lang's false selves, you spend some time with that, has it's explained to me what I have not been able to understand, and that is, who are these people, the deniers and the non-mask wearers that shoot people or threaten people with masks on, or threaten stores that require masks. And you talk about creating a real authentic self is not easy work, and that sometimes it's easier just to click into a false self, and I think that tribal self in a negative way, not in a positive way, that so many of those, they're doing the same thing, they're saying the same thing. Seems to me like what is happening. I'm wondering what you think about that. They belong to the non-masked tribe for denial reasons, or just because they're tougher, or because they're better, but it seemed to explain something about it. So what do you think?
Well, you've got two questions there.
I always have more than one.
One
No,
is-
I'm sorry.
One is how are we going to do, what are we going to do with our tendency to become tribal under stress? And it's interesting to me because a lot of the people that I talk to are, at least in the past, I've addressed people who are members of Native American tribes. They're very powerful, and they say our tribal identity is all we've got. And you're trying to take that away from us if you don't acknowledge our tribe. And I don't know what to say to them on that. It would be very difficult for me to say, here's one more thing that the dominant culture is trying to take away from you. On the other hand, when the dominant culture forms tribes, it's pretty awful to watch. And so when I go downtown in Stanley, well, Stanley's very small, so it's sort of down village. But when I go down there and I see people running around with big diesel pickups that have offensive bumper stickers, and they cluster together, and prior to the pandemic, if you walked into a bar, you didn't feel welcome. Not with your, Save the Bears Ears t-shirt on. It could get ugly. And by and large, I do think that if people are in the business of forming tribes within white communities these days, it is pretty ugly. And I can say that, as an old white guy. If that gets on very dicey territory. You don't necessarily want to sit down and talk about tribes to people who are in a tribe, regardless of how they define that tribe. The question I like a little bit more is this idea of forming a false self in relation to cultural expectations. And I've got a fairly long chapter about sort of starting life in a ski resort where life was always good. You know, and my parents both worked for the resort of Sun Valley, so it meant that I got to ski free. And at age 22, I got hired by the corporation that runs Sun Valley and became an executive in training. And somehow I got out of that. You know, somehow I was able to look at that as a velvet line trap. And I didn't take the identity that was offered me as an athletic 22-year-old who was going to be able to boss people around. For some reason, that didn't appeal to me very much. Part of it was being taught to see skiing, running a ski resort as agriculture, you know, and you stopped looking at the people who were skiing on the slopes as human beings, and you saw them as domesticated animals who had to be taken care of, fed, and carted off if they got injured. R.D. Laing has this idea that almost everybody gets caught in that trap because we live in a culture that rewards certain types of behavior and punishes other behavior, and you don't get a choice as to what behavior you would like to do. You only get rewarded or punished. And over time, you learn to create this self that is completely alienated from the person you really want to be. And so you have, to give another example, my father was a fishing guide in the 50s here in the valley, and we were, as I said, poor. I mean, he was charging $10 a day for his clients and guaranteeing a Chinook salmon on the line. And some of those clients that didn't get the Chinook salmon on the line refused to pay, even though he'd spent a day out with them on fishing. A lot of those people who were, you know, doctors and lawyers and CEOs, and one of them was Sherman Adams, who was a presidential advisor for Ike Eisenhower. They would tell him in the middle of fishing for salmon out, you know, having gotten up in a frosty morning, and we're sitting there on the bank, you know, freezing their butts off, and they were saying to him, I'd trade my life for yours in a minute. And what possibly else can you think except these guys were living inauthentic lives, and they were attracted to what they saw as my father's authenticity, you know, the fact that he was grounded, that as I said in my reading today, you know, that he had managed to honor the real any way he could. Well, to have a real self, you have to honor the real almost as a daily ritual. And I think R.D. Laing picked up on that really well. I think his book, Politics of Experience, if it's not on your bookshelf, it should be. And that will explain a lot of this. R.D. Laing was sort of drummed out of the British psychiatric establishment, and his almost everybody you talk to who is part of that establishment considers Laing crazy. But he was crazy with an awful lot of good things to say. Have we run out of questions?
Well, I have, I guess it's a question. Partly how I deal with some of the inequality and differences in lifestyle is decades ago, maybe I'm dating myself, as an academic, John Rawls had offered a theory of desirable social organization. And his approach was that if you stand outside the social structure you're trying to work on, and you don't know who you will be born as, that maybe you're going to get closer to something that's compatible with human nature, and that part of an unfortunate, I guess, part of human nature is if there's someone who's worse off than you can be more content. But if there's someone you can wish you were, you have a kind of an optimism, a hope that even if you don't want it, maybe the people around you would want that kind of success. It doesn't solve the problems that we're talking about directly, and in some ways it's very dark about human nature, that there's always going to be, well, no, there isn't always going to be somebody at the very bottom, because however they perceive it, they will think that someone else is worse off than they are. I don't know if that helps, but are there echoes of that in some of how you view the way the future is going? There will still be people who are more fortunate and less fortunate, and an opportunity for human contentment in the middle of that. Does that make any sense?
Well, the opportunity for human contentment makes a lot of sense, because I do think you find it in your relationships with others and in your ability to be kind to others. That's a pretty hard lesson for someone raised in sort of a Ayn Randian society to learn. But I think usually by the time we get old enough to date ourselves, I used to make a joke that it was the only way I could get a date, but then I met Julie. Anyway, when you get to be our age, you do discover that kindness, really, if you want to start feeling better, you start doing kind things to the people around you, or for the people around you is probably a better way to phrase it. But I think there's a chapter in my book where I talk about the social contract and how much what happens when you've got a whole bunch of people on the bottom and a few people on the top, and how do you keep those people on the top secure from the people on the bottom who might get really angry with the people above them. And the idea is that, they use force and intimidation, and the point of the spear is the metaphor I use. But now we seem to be operating under a social contract that is kicking people off the bottom tier and not allowing them into the social contract at all. And I think that's a sign that probably the way we look at our culture and the way it's organized is due for some enormous change, and it's not going to be pretty. But that's about all I can do to answer your question. It's not a pretty picture.
Well, thank you for the question, Ro. Don Rawlings, you had your hand up and now you're unmuted, but now your camera's off. So are you there looking to still ask your question?
Yes. It may be kind of redundant after the last question, but I grew up just not too far from you in Libby, Montana, and on a ranch. And one of the things I've been thinking about while you've been talking is that kind of instinctual mutual responsibility that occurs in communities like that, despite all the divisions and tribal behaviors and all the rest, that in critical situations, people seem to help each other no matter what. And I'm thinking more recently of, I'm not usually this positive, by the way, and I really like R.D. Laing. But I think more recently of driving on a back road in Idaho and having the gravel tear apart a tire, and within 15, 20 minutes, a rancher had stopped with a better wrench than mine and switched the tire. And a woman came along and drove 20 miles with us to get us to a tire store. And I think they probably both, pardon the expression, voted for Trump. And I obviously didn't. But I'm wondering about mutual responsibility in the sense it's important in theoretical anarchist discussions, and why it isn't maybe as convincing for us now. I can see reasons why that's not the case, but it still seems to exist, and it makes a difference in the present, even if not in the future, in the present. And I'll leave it at that. I'm just kind of wondering what you think about it.
I was speaking with two friends yesterday about a third friend who is a terrible bigot, who would do practically anything for you if he found you broken down on one of our country roads around here. Who all you have to do is be in an awkward or be in trouble in some way, and he will help you out. But for somebody who doesn't know any Black people, he certainly spends a lot of time complaining about them and cursing them and saying awful things about them. And I don't understand that. You know, I'm writing a blog these days, and one of the things I've been writing about is how many barriers we have around us, almost like a minefield of bigotry that makes it uncommon to see people of color in our resort areas. And I'm not sure what that means. I'm not sure what sort of guilt it needs to call forth in those of us who are essentially in a bunker. I mean, you know, my defense is I was born here, but that's sometimes that's a little awkward to explain, and you get into these conversations where you simply can't win. on these things. But in relation to that sense of community, there is sort of a, an old Western ethic that comes about because we need to depend on each other. And you can see that in this community in the winter when we get down to about 100 people. Regardless of what we feel about each other, there are certain rules that mean you have to help somebody who's in trouble out. And, and there's funny things that come out about that, if somebody gets in trouble and they're out backcountry skiing, you have to go help them and do anything to get them to a road. If you have to build a sled out of bungee cords and skis, you have to get them there rather than call search and rescue, because if they call search and rescue, then that's really bad. People will give you a bad time about that for years. But if you're a friend and you help that person get out and you keep your mouth shut about it, you've done your duty, and you've kept the social contract intact. So, yes.
So on that note, I have a question. So how can we translate that unconditional interpersonal kind of willingness to give assistance and kindness when the person is right in front of you? How do we translate that to a larger scale? And where, why is that so difficult? Does that make sense?
Well, I think it doesn't translate very well to scale. That, we've been living in a culture that since probably the start of the 20th century, economists have kept hitting us with the phrase economies of scale. And what has happened is at scale, you begin to lose stuff. And so the phrase act global or think globally, act locally reflects that a little bit. But I don't think once you start applying the concept of mass culture, I think a lot of those local values, those human values tend to go out the window. And that's why we look at the man in the gray flannel suit, to date myself, as a phrase that, evokes someplace we don't want to be, some person we don't want to be. So I'm very pessimistic about that particular transfer. I don't think these things work at scale. I think they work in the bubbles that we can kind of create around ourselves, almost like a pandemic bubble in using that concept. And I want to say while I'm speaking, I don't normally pontificate this much. It's a holdover from the time that I was a professor and I had a classroom full of students. My book is more of a witnessing. And the idea behind that is that I tried to think about what would happen if somebody who was a Roman in 410 AD, when things were all falling to pieces and all of a sudden people were having to drink from the Tiber, which wasn't good for them, if that Roman had just written down what they had seen day to day to day and tried to do intelligent observations, but not draw necessarily any conclusions. I tried to write that book because I I really decided what I wanted was that Romans book, and he didn't do it. You know, we've got lots of Romans saying, you know, this is the way you live a virtuous life, but nobody's saying this is the life that I'm seeing among my friends and neighbors as things are falling apart. So in many ways, I'm trying to be an honest witness to the times, and you can draw your own conclusions from that.
Well, John, I think that was, though I loved your pontificating, as you call it, I didn't. You were asked questions and you answered them modestly, but that book has got so much in it that those of you who have not read it really should. It is a witness, and it's witnessing all different things, and you look at it with different eyes, like R.D. Laing eyes, and well, I can't remember right now, but I love the way you wove strands together, you know, people that have influenced you, and so you look at it from that perspective. And I thank you for writing that book.
Thank you for liking that book. And I did want to show the cover to everyone. When I first saw the cover design, I was a little bit dismayed because it looked like a child sort of erasing a picture of the earth. And then I realized that maybe that's what we've done as children. And I've really had a lot of good comments on the cover. So I'm grateful to the designer. Also, I do have a website at johnrember.com, and I am writing a weekly blog on the pandemic. I've got a journal of the plague year going, and it's more witnessing, but with a little closer focus on our day-to-day life and what we're doing here in this tourist community. So in many ways, it's about pandemic tourism and how this new thing in our lives is affecting our lives in ways we never imagined. So it's a continuation, a sequel, as it were.
Yep. Okay.
Thank you very, very much. And this has been really nice. Susan, thank you for your assistance. And I'm really glad to do it. I hope I can show up in person and have a reading someplace.
I hope so too. I'd love to see you in person and maybe do a reading and then you talk, and then maybe a few of us corner you and we go have a different kind of a talk about the same kind of things or new things, because I think the pandemic has sharpened the edge of all you have said. And now it looks like with your blog, you're going into that area. And what now can be added to some of the things you've said. That's interesting. So thank you very much for agreeing to do this talk with us. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you everybody for coming.
For me.
Yes, thank you for coming, and maybe we'll see you again. Bye now.